May 1945. The city of Prague trembled under a grey sky heavy with smoke and fear. The war was ending, but death hadn't left. Hitler was gone. Berlin had fallen. Yet here in the heart of Europe, the Third Reich's claws still gripped tight. For 6 years, the people of Prague had lived like ghosts under the Nazi shadow, whispering freedom only behind closed doors. But that silence was about to end. The Reich was dying, its armies broken, its flags burning. The end had come, but not quietly. Deep beneath the streets, in a small hidden cellar, a radio operator tuned his transmitter and spoke the words that would ignite an entire city. "Czechs!" His voice trembled but grew stronger with each syllable. "The hour has come. Rise against the occupiers." That call pierced every wall, every street, every heart. Within minutes, the city erupted. Men left their homes with rifles stolen from German depots. Women tore curtains to make bandages. Children carried messages through alleyways, while church bells rang across the rooftops. It was chaos, but it was freedom's chaos. In Wenceslas Square, crowds overturned trams, building barricades from wood and steel. Flags once banned by the Reich fluttered high again, red, white, blue, symbols of a nation reborn. But liberation never comes without blood. The Germans, though surrounded and desperate, struck back with brutal force. SS officers barked orders. Tanks rumbled through narrow streets. The Nazis had one command: hold Prague until the last breath of the Reich. The air filled with gunfire, screams, and the deep roar of machine guns echoing between stone walls. Yet the people didn't run. They fought with everything they had. A tram driver rammed his own vehicle into an armored car, dying in the crash, but blocking the road. A nurse turned her hospital into a command post, her white uniform stained red as she treated fighters and loaded rifles. A teenage boy climbed the city hall tower, raising the Czech flag before being struck down by a sniper. His body fell, but the flag stayed. The city became a furnace. Buildings burned, smoke covered the sun, and the smell of cordite mixed with the scent of wet cobblestone. The rebels had little ammunition, few supplies, no reinforcements. But they had fury, and that was enough. Every street turned into a fortress, every home into a bunker. As the night deepened, explosions painted the sky orange. The old city, beautiful and ancient, screamed with fire and freedom. The Nazi command was unraveling. Messages to Berlin went unanswered. Hitler was dead, though they didn't yet know it. The SS still fought as if their leader might rise from the grave. The people fought knowing he never would. "Hold the line," someone shouted over the radio. "Hold until dawn." And they did. Through the dark hours, Prague bled and burned but refused to bow. This was no army. It was a rebellion born from rage, from memory, from the weight of every lost life. The rebels believed that if they could survive one more day, the Allies would reach them. Rumors spread of Soviet tanks rolling from the east, of Americans nearing from the west. But no one knew when or if they'd arrive. So they fought as if no one would. Each gunshot was defiance, each explosion a heartbeat of a dying empire. And as the night gave way to dawn, Prague still stood, not conquered, not surrendered, but alive. The forgotten revolt had begun, and it would echo far beyond the smoke, shaking the last hour of the Nazi Reich. Dawn crept over Prague like a ghost. The fires still burned, black smoke curling into the pale morning sky. The sound of church bells mixed with distant gunfire, a strange symphony of hope and horror. The rebels had survived the night, but at a cost. Streets once filled with laughter were now lined with rubble and bodies. The people of Prague had risen, and now they had to hold. They knew the Germans wouldn't stop. The SS commander, General Rudolf Toussaint, paced his headquarters, furious and desperate. His orders from what remained of the Nazi high command were clear. Prague must not fall, no matter the price. Tanks rolled down narrow streets, their treads crushing the cobblestones, machine guns sweeping across windows where rebels hid. But something had changed. The fear that once ruled Prague was gone. Civilians fought with reckless courage, driven by the simple truth that they had nothing left to lose. In one corner of the city, resistance fighters captured a German radio post and began broadcasting their own messages. "This is Prague," they said. "We are free citizens, and we will never surrender." The signal crackled through the airwaves, reaching villages miles away. The message was clear. The Czech people were standing, and the world would soon have to notice. In Wenceslas Square, a group of young fighters dragged a captured tank into position. They didn't even know how to drive it, but they learned by instinct, firing its gun down the street and watching a Nazi convoy explode. Cheers erupted, echoing through the ruins. For a moment, the city forgot the fear of death. But the Germans hit back harder. Shells ripped through buildings. Snipers hunted from the rooftops. The radio fell silent more than once, its operators killed mid-broadcast. And yet every time the transmission returned, the same words were repeated. "Prague lives. We fight." By the afternoon of May 6th, the battle had turned into a siege. German forces surrounded the city centre, cutting off food and water. The rebels were running out of bullets, fighting hand-to-hand in alleys littered with glass and flame. But hope had a sound, the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. From the east came rumors. The Red Army was near. From the west, American pilots reported seeing the smoke of Prague from their cockpits. The city was a beacon of defiance in the dying light of Nazi power. Inside a bombed church, a priest gave his last sermon to a room full of fighters. "Even if we die," he said, "the truth of what we did here will live." His voice was calm, steady, and when he finished, he picked up a rifle and joined them at the door. Every face in that room carried the same fire. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting so their children could live without fear. Outside, explosions tore through the air, glass rained from shattered windows, and still they held the line. The Germans called for reinforcements, but none came. The Reich was finished, its promises of dominance now whispers in the rubble. And yet it refused to die quietly. By nightfall, the city was divided block by block, each side claiming victory that slipped through their fingers. The radio repeated the same words again and again. "Hold the barricades. Hold for Prague." Across Europe, peace treaties were being signed, generals were surrendering, but in Prague, the war refused to end. The forgotten revolt had become the Reich's final nightmare. The flames that lit the city weren't just fire, they were history, burning itself into memory. This was not the end of Prague. This was its rebirth, forged in smoke and sacrifice, as the last breath of the Nazi Empire turned to silence. May 1945, Europe was collapsing. The Third Reich, once a roaring machine of terror, was now gasping for its final breath. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and yet Prague was still under Nazi control. It was the last shadow of a dying empire. The people of Prague had spent 6 long years living under occupation. They had seen their freedom stolen, their culture suppressed, their neighbors disappear in the night. Every street corner carried memories of loss. But under that silence, something had been building, an anger too deep to bury. The revolt didn't start with generals or politicians. It began with ordinary people, teachers, tram drivers, students, mothers. On May 5, 1945, a single radio broadcast changed everything. The words were simple: "Czechs, rise up. This is the moment." Within hours, the entire city was alive with rebellion. Civilians seized weapons from German depots. Police officers switched sides. Flags were torn from Nazi buildings and replaced with the red, white, and blue of Czechoslovakia. Crowds filled Wenceslas Square, chanting for freedom. For the first time in years, the sound of defiance echoed louder than fear. The uprising spread like fire. German soldiers, trapped between orders to hold and the reality of defeat, responded with brutality. Tanks rolled through Prague, shelling entire blocks to crush resistance. But the people refused to break. They fought with stolen rifles, with Molotov cocktails, with whatever they could find. Women carried messages through the sewers. Teenagers threw grenades from rooftops. In one district, a group of mechanics converted streetcars into makeshift barricades. The tram lines became lifelines of resistance, connecting neighborhoods under siege. The entire city turned into a battlefield. Every bridge, every building a fortress. The rebels had no uniform, no central command, only a shared determination that this would be their final stand. Meanwhile, chaos reigned inside the German command. General Rudolf Toussaint, in charge of Prague's defense, knew the war was lost. Berlin had fallen, but the Nazi hierarchy still demanded loyalty to a ghost. Hitler's death had not stopped the killing. Orders came from what remained of the high command: hold Prague at all costs. Toussaint knew it was madness, yet his officers, fearful of retribution, obeyed. Columns of SS troops poured into the city center, attacking civilians with flamethrowers and grenades. Hospitals were bombed. Churches became shelters for the wounded. But even as the city burned, the resistance found new strength. One of the most powerful tools the rebels had was the radio. They used it not just for coordination, but for hope. "Here speaks Free Prague," the announcers said, their voices trembling but unbroken. "The Czech nation is rising. We call on all allies, help us." These broadcasts reached London, Moscow, and Washington. The world heard Prague's cry for freedom, but help was slow to come. The Americans had halted near Pilsen, just 60 miles away, following an agreement with the Soviets. They were told not to advance further east. So Prague waited for the Red Army, for deliverance, for the end. By May the 6th, the situation had become desperate. Ammunition was running out. Food was scarce. The dead filled the streets. Yet morale refused to die. When one radio station was destroyed, another began broadcasting from a hidden basement. A Czech doctor was overheard saying, "We have no medicine left, but we have courage, and that is enough." In the midst of this chaos, an unlikely alliance formed. German soldiers from anti-Nazi units, realizing the war was over, began joining the rebels. Together, they fought against the SS. It was a strange and bitter twist, Germans helping Czechs to defeat Germans. History has few ironies as sharp as that. The revolt was not organized warfare, it was survival with purpose. It was a city saying no to oppression, even at the edge of death. Prague's streets were covered in smoke, but beneath that haze, the soul of a nation was shining through. The people had no guarantee of victory, but they understood one thing clearly: freedom was worth dying for. And in those last days of the war, the Czech capital became the beating heart of defiance. The final place where the Nazi dream was truly shattered, not by armies, but by the will of the people. As dawn broke over the battered streets of Prague, the sound of machine guns echoed off the empty facades. It was May 5, 1945, just 3 days before Germany's surrender. But inside the city, chaos still ruled. Thousands of civilians had risen against their German occupiers, transforming the capital into a battleground. The resistance was fierce, desperate, and vastly outnumbered. The Czech insurgents, students, policemen, and ordinary citizens, fought with stolen rifles and homemade grenades. They believed freedom was within reach, but the cost would be unimaginable. The uprising began with a simple act of defiance. Czech radio stations, once silenced by Nazi censors, suddenly crackled back to life. Voices called out to the nation, "Czechs, help us! The time has come." Those words, broadcast across Prague, ignited a fire that the Germans could no longer control. Crowds took to the streets, tearing down swastikas, seizing weapons, and turning trams into barricades. By midday, entire neighborhoods had fallen into rebel hands. But the German garrison, still numbering over 30,000 troops, struck back with brutal force. Tanks rolled down narrow cobblestone streets, their tracks crushing the hopes of an unarmed population. Buildings burned. The air smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and fear. Yet the resistance refused to surrender. In the chaos, the Czech National Council, formed in secret just weeks earlier, took command of the revolt. They pleaded for Allied assistance, sending urgent messages to both the Americans and the Soviets. "Prague rises for freedom. Help us!" But politics, as always, moved slower than war. The Americans, halted by Eisenhower's orders, could not advance into the city. The Soviets, still miles away, hesitated until their own strategic goals aligned. The result? The people of Prague were left alone to face the storm. By the night of May 6th, the situation grew dire. Ammunition was running out. German artillery shelled the city center relentlessly. Civilians sought shelter in cellars, while makeshift hospitals overflowed with wounded fighters. Yet even then, the will to fight burned on. Across the river, a group of railway workers managed to derail a German supply train, cutting off reinforcements and buying precious hours. Meanwhile, inside the old town, priests opened church towers for snipers. Teenagers carried Molotovs instead of school books. Every street became a fortress. Every house a declaration of defiance. Then came an unexpected twist: the arrival of the Russian Liberation Army, the ROA. These were former Soviet soldiers who had defected to fight for the Germans. But now, in the war's final chaos, they turned their guns against their Nazi masters. Led by General Andrei Vlasov, the ROA joined the Prague rebels in fierce street battles. Together, they pushed back the German SS divisions, capturing tanks and freeing key districts. For a fleeting moment, victory seemed possible. But that hope carried its own price. The Allies viewed Vlasov's forces as traitors, and Soviet command demanded their immediate withdrawal. Within 48 hours, the ROA vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving the resistance once again surrounded. On May 7th, German troops counterattacked with ruthless precision, retaking block after block. Fires consumed entire quarters of the city. Still, the rebels refused to yield. In the underground tunnels, families whispered prayers, while above them freedom fighters continued to fight street by street. Then came a rumor: Hitler was dead. The word spread like wildfire. Some dropped their weapons in disbelief. Others cried out in rage. The Reich's hour was ending, but its dying grasp was still deadly. As Prague burned, the last remnants of Nazi command sought to crush the uprising before the Soviets could arrive. It was now a race against time, one final struggle between tyranny and freedom, fought in the dying light of a collapsing empire. As the uprising raged through the streets of Prague, the German high command grew desperate. General Rudolf Toussaint, the city's military governor, watched from his headquarters as flames devoured block after block. The once proud capital of Bohemia had become a maze of smoke and fire. The Reich was collapsing, and Toussaint knew it. Yet orders from Berlin still demanded control. No surrender, no retreat. Hitler might have been dead, but his ghost still dictated the fight. Every soldier in the city knew this was the endgame. The last breath of the Third Reich was being fought not on grand battlefields, but in narrow streets filled with ordinary citizens. Prague's cobblestones became rivers of blood and defiance. By May 7th, the resistance was fracturing. Communication lines had broken down. Many cells fought in isolation. Ammunition was almost gone. But even cornered, the people refused to yield. They had survived 6 years of occupation, and now, with the war's finish line in sight, they would not bow. Meanwhile, deep beneath the city, in the cold tunnels of the metro, the Czech National Council gathered by candlelight. Maps lay spread across a wooden table marked with pins and bloodstains. Their mission was clear: hold out until the Soviets arrived. But when? Each hour felt like eternity. Every explosion above them could mean another district lost. Reports came in of summary executions, of civilians shot on sight, of entire neighborhoods flattened. The SS troops showed no mercy. Still, the council's leader, Albert Pražák, stood firm. "We fight," he said, "not because we can win, but because surrender would mean forgetting who we are." His words lit a spark in the gloom. Above ground, the rebels launched one final offensive in the city's heart, the Charles Bridge. What was once a landmark of culture now became a front line. Fighters crawled behind statues, hurling Molotovs at German tanks that clattered across the stone. The Vltava River reflected the fires of the city, as if Prague itself was burning in its own reflection. Then came a moment of eerie silence. From the north, the roar of engines filled the air. For a heartbeat, hope surged. Were these Soviet tanks? But when the dust cleared, the truth shattered them. They were German reinforcements. Columns from the Waffen-SS had broken through the outer defenses. The resistance was now encircled. Toussaint's forces began their final push. Artillery pounded the old town square. Entire buildings vanished in clouds of smoke. Yet even in this inferno, acts of bravery continued. A group of firefighters refused to flee. Instead, They turned their hoses toward the flames to save trapped civilians while bullets whistled past their helmets. In another district, a teenage girl named Eva carried ammunition across rooftops, her figure outlined against the glow of burning spires. She made it through the night, but never returned from the next run. Every life lost added weight to the rebellion's story. Toussaint, in his bunker, finally faced the truth. Prague could not be subdued without destroying it completely. But pride, duty, and fear of Hitler's wrath still chained him. Then late that night, word reached him that the German High Command had signed the act of surrender at Reims. The war was over, officially. But for Prague it wasn't. Orders had not yet arrived to cease fire, and communication lines were chaos. So as the world celebrated peace, Prague bled on in silence. For its people, freedom was still measured in lives, not hours. By the morning of May 8, 1945, the city of Prague lay in ruins. Smoke hung over its rooftops like a heavy shroud. The sounds of gunfire echoed less frequently now, replaced by the eerie crackle of burning buildings. The uprising had lasted 3 relentless days, and the resistance fighters were at their limit. Yet they stood their ground, clutching their dwindling weapons, waiting for salvation that never came. In the German headquarters, General Toussaint faced his breaking point. Messages from Berlin had ceased. The Führer was gone. The Reich was finished. And still, the SS units around him refused to accept defeat. Many officers feared Soviet capture more than death itself. In those final hours, chaos reigned even among the occupiers. Some German commanders sought to negotiate with the Czech National Council, hoping to surrender to the Americans instead of the Red Army. Others wanted to fight to the last bullet. Prague had become a chessboard of desperation, every move leading closer to annihilation. As negotiations began, the city's defenders knew that trust was dangerous, but so was refusal. The council's envoys met Toussaint's officers in a makeshift command post, a dimly lit room that smelled of smoke and sweat. They demanded one thing: the Germans must withdraw immediately, leaving the city unharmed. In return, the rebels promised safe passage for retreating troops heading west. It was a fragile bargain, built on exhaustion and mutual fear. Toussaint agreed. At dawn on May 9th, the German garrison began pulling out of the city. Trucks and tanks rumbled westward through streets lined with corpses and rubble. For the first time in 6 years, Prague's people stepped out into the open air, battered, starved, but unbroken. They had survived the impossible. Then from the east came the low thunder of artillery. The Soviets had arrived. Red Army tanks rolled into Prague's smoking streets, greeted by tears and cheers. The long-awaited liberators had come, but their arrival carried a shadow of irony. The Czechs had fought and bled for their freedom, only to see it replaced by another occupation, one wrapped in different flags and promises. Yet in that moment, all they felt was relief. The nightmare of Nazi rule was finally over. In his final report, General Toussaint wrote that the uprising had no military purpose, but history would judge otherwise. It had given the dying war a final act of defiance, a city refusing to kneel even as empires crumbled around it. As Soviet soldiers marched past the ruins, they saw walls scrawled with words in Czech, "We lived free, if only for a few days." Those words would outlast the battles, the treaties, and the flags that followed. They were proof that even at the very end, humanity can still rise against darkness. In the quiet after the storm, survivors wandered through the shattered streets, searching for family, for food, for any sign of what came next. Fires still burned in some quarters, but amid the ashes, children played with discarded helmets, their laughter echoing through the rubble. Life somehow had returned. Decades later, historians would debate the true cost of the Prague uprising. Thousands dead, entire districts destroyed. But for those who lived it, the answer was simple. It was the moment when the Czech people proved that freedom, even fleeting, was worth every sacrifice. In the last days of World War II, while the world celebrated victory, one forgotten city fought its own battle to remind history that courage does not need to win. It only needs to stand. As the German withdrawal began, Prague stood between two collapsing worlds, the fading shadow of the Reich and the rising power of the Red Army. In the heart of the city, the resistance still held scattered strongpoints, not out of strategy, but pride. Each street, each barricade had become sacred ground. The battle might have been declared over, but in Prague, peace came only through smoke. On the morning of May 9th, 1945, as Soviet tanks thundered toward the city, chaos erupted once more. Columns of retreating Germans clashed with advancing Russians on the outskirts, turning escape routes into kill zones. The rebels, caught between them, watched history collide at their doorsteps. Amid the confusion, rumors spread that the Germans were planning to blow up the bridges across the Vltava River, to erase their own passage and cripple the city. The Czech National Council knew that if that happened, thousands trapped on both sides would die. A small team of resistance fighters volunteered for an impossible task: stop the demolition before it was too late. Among them was Captain František Bartoš, a former engineer turned fighter. With barely a dozen men and 2 trucks of stolen explosives, he raced toward the Palacky Bridge, where German engineers were seen preparing charges. Every second mattered. The roads were littered with debris and corpses. Flames from nearby buildings licked the dawn sky. As they neared the bridge, Bartoš ordered the men to cut their engines. They would move the rest of the way on foot. The sound of distant artillery covered their approach. They could see the Germans now: 3 trucks, several soldiers, and a set of wired detonators. Bartoš raised his hand, signaling silence. He whispered, "We end this now." Then, with a breath, the attack began. The first shot rang out, striking the German officer by the truck. Chaos erupted instantly. Bullets whipped through the fog. Czech fighters stormed forward, hurling grenades and firing blindly through the smoke. Bartoš reached the charges, cutting wires with his knife as explosions thundered around him. 2 of his men fell beside him, struck by gunfire. He didn't stop. A German soldier lunged from behind, and Bartoš struck him with the butt of his rifle before throwing both of them into the river below. Moments later, silence. The bridge still stood. The mission had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Only 5 of the 12 men survived. As they retreated, Bartoš looked back at the bridge, its arches blackened by smoke but unbroken. "Let it stand," he whispered. That single act saved thousands of lives and preserved the heart of Prague from destruction. Meanwhile, across the city, Soviet forces poured in. The Red Army's First Ukrainian Front, led by Marshal Ivan Konev, stormed the western districts, crushing the last pockets of German resistance. Soviet banners replaced Nazi flags atop government buildings. Civilians emerged from basements, cheering through tears. The city was free but not untouched. The bodies of fighters lay unburied in the streets they had died defending. The sound of victory was mixed with mourning. In the ruins of the old town hall, the Czech National Council gathered once again. They had survived the war, but their future was uncertain. The Soviets brought liberation, yes, but also a new kind of control. Still, for that one day, the people of Prague felt something pure: pride. The forgotten revolt had ended not in surrender, but in triumph carved from tragedy. And though their names would fade in the shadow of greater battles, their courage would echo through generations. In that final moment of defiance, Prague didn't just shake the Reich's last hour, it shattered it. As the smoke cleared over Prague, the city awoke to a silence that felt foreign. The thunder of artillery had stopped, the screams had faded, and all that remained was the crackle of fires eating through the ruins. It was May 9th, 1945, the morning after liberation. But beneath the ashes, stories of sacrifice still whispered through the streets. Captain Bartoš and his surviving fighters regrouped near the riverbank. Their uniforms were torn, faces blackened with soot, but their eyes carried the light of victory. The bridge still stood, its stones scarred but unbroken, a symbol of Prague itself. Around them, civilians poured out of hiding, waving tattered Czech flags and embracing one another. Some wept, others sang. Old women kissed the hands of young soldiers who had saved their city. Yet even as joy returned, a new unease began to creep in. Soviet troops flooded the streets, their tanks rolling past the same barricades where rebels had fought just hours earlier. To the people, they were liberators. To the survivors, they were strangers bearing new orders. At the radio station, where the uprising had first begun, Czech broadcasters returned to the air. Their voices trembled with emotion as they announced, "Prague is free." The sound reached every corner of the city, echoing off broken walls and church towers. For those who had lost everything, those words were worth the world. But freedom, like the smoke above them, was fleeting. In the following hours, the Red Army began asserting control, disarming resistance units and taking over government buildings. Some Czech fighters resisted. Most complied, exhausted beyond argument. The city that had fought so bravely now bowed quietly to a new flag. Still, none could deny what they had achieved. Against impossible odds, they had risen and won back their home before the world even knew they had fought. Historians would later call it the forgotten revolt, but for those who lived it, it was unforgettable. In the courtyard of the old town hall, survivors buried their fallen comrades in makeshift graves. They marked them with wooden crosses, each carved with the same word, freedom. Children placed flowers beside them, the petals fluttering in the morning breeze. A Soviet officer watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He had seen hundreds of cities liberated and destroyed, but Prague was different. It had liberated itself. By midday, official Soviet reports declared the capital secured, and Red Army banners waved over the castle. Marshal Konev met with members of the Czech National Council, promising friendship and reconstruction. Cameras captured handshakes and smiles, but behind them lay exhaustion and silent grief. In the shadows of history, this moment would fade beneath the noise of greater victories. Yet in Prague's soul it was everything. As dusk fell, Captain Bartosz stood once more on the Palacky Bridge, staring at the river that had carried away his fallen friends. The water glowed red in the sunset, as if reflecting the price of freedom. He whispered to himself, "They will remember us, even if history forgets." The wind carried his words across the city, over rooftops and ruins, through the streets where rebellion had been born. That night Prague slept for the first time in years, not peacefully, but proudly. The Reich had fallen, the war was ending, and though the world would soon move on, the city had written its own ending. A final act of defiance that no empire could erase. The morning after the battle ended, Prague looked like a ghost of its former self. Entire districts lay in ruin. The smell of smoke clung to the air like a memory that refused to fade. Rubble filled the streets where children once played, and the once glorious city now stood silent under the shadow of victory. The uprising had lasted only a few days, but those days reshaped the destiny of a nation. Across Europe, newspapers called it the last battle of the war. Yet behind the headlines, the truth was far more complex. The Prague uprising had not just ended the war, it had revealed the cost of freedom. In the aftermath, the Czech National Council worked tirelessly to restore order. Food was scarce, water lines shattered, communication crippled. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Families searched through the rubble, calling names that would never be answered. But amid the devastation, something powerful stirred, a sense of unity that no conqueror could break. In makeshift shelters, people shared bread and stories. Survivors spoke of heroes, men and women who had fought without hesitation, who had died without regret. They spoke of Captain Bartosz and his men, of the students who defended the bridges, of the nurses who refused to abandon their patients even as shells fell. These stories became the heartbeat of the new Prague. As the Soviets established control, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Red Army brought aid but also authority. The Czech resistance, once celebrated, was now viewed with suspicion. Many of its leaders were quietly silenced or absorbed into Soviet-aligned structures. The city that had liberated itself was learning a harsh truth. Freedom won in battle could still be lost in politics. Yet despite the growing unease, the spirit of the revolt endured. Artists, teachers, and poets began to record the memories of those dark days, preserving the legacy that others tried to erase. Murals appeared on surviving walls, showing figures with raised fists against the flames. One read, "We fought alone, but not in vain." That phrase spread through Prague like an oath. In schools, children learned of the uprising through whispered lessons because official textbooks ignored it. It became a secret story, carried in hearts rather than papers. Meanwhile, abroad, the world moved on. The Nuremberg trials began. Germany was divided, and Europe rebuilt itself from the ashes. But in the quiet corners of Prague, survivors still gathered every May, lighting candles by the Vltava and remembering the days when their city defied an empire. For them, the war did not truly end in Reims or Berlin. It ended here, in Prague, where ordinary people had stood against impossible odds. In 1946, a memorial was built on the site of the old town hall. Beneath its simple inscription lay the names of those who had died for the uprising, names that had never been recorded by armies or governments. Tourists would later pass by without noticing, but for the people of Prague, it was sacred ground. Every flower placed there was a promise that their struggle would not be forgotten. And though the years ahead would bring new rulers, new lies, and new chains, the memory of 1945 remained untamed. It whispered through generations, a reminder that courage is not measured by victory, but by the will to stand when all seems lost. Decades later, when the Iron Curtain began to crumble, Prague's forgotten revolt resurfaced like a long-buried truth. Old men who had once been young rebels spoke again, their voices trembling but proud. They brought out faded flags, rusted weapons, and secret diaries, proof that their fight had been real, not myth. The new generation listened in awe, realizing that the freedom they now demanded had been paid for long ago in blood and silence. Television documentaries aired interviews with surviving resistance members. One woman, her hands shaking, recalled how she had smuggled messages beneath loaves of bread, how every knock on the door could have meant death. Another man, a former radio operator, told how he had broadcast calls for help in the final hours, knowing no one might come. Their faces, lined with time, reflected the same fire that had once lit the city's streets. Scholars and historians re-examined the events of May 1945, piecing together what official archives had buried. They found evidence of betrayal, of secret negotiations, of moments when allies hesitated and civilians paid the price. Yet even in these revelations, the bravery of the people stood untarnished. It became clear that Prague's uprising had not been a footnote. It had been a final cry of defiance against tyranny. In 1989, when students flooded Wenceslas Square during the Velvet Revolution, they carried portraits of those same resistance heroes. For Prague, one banner read, "Then and now." The spirit of the uprising had returned, not with guns, but with candles and chants. Once again, the city stood against oppression. This time it won. Today, the Prague uprising is no longer forgotten. Memorials stand across the city, each one telling a fragment of the story. School children visit them, laying flowers, listening to recordings of survivors' voices. Museums display uniforms, letters, and the burned radio transmitter that had called out for help in 1945. Tour guides speak of courage, of tragedy, of hope reborn. And every year, on May 5th, the bells of Prague ring out, not for war, but for remembrance. When you walk through those streets now, it's hard to imagine the chaos that once ruled them. Cafes hum with laughter, trams rattle past restored buildings, and the air smells of roasted coffee instead of gunpowder. Yet if you pause by the memorials, you can still feel it. The heartbeat of resistance, the echo of voices refusing to be silenced. In that moment, Prague is not just a city, it's a living monument to human resilience. The forgotten revolt that once shook the Reich's last hour now stands as proof that history never truly dies. It waits, patient and proud, to be remembered. And as the sun sets behind the red roofs and the Vltava glitters below, you can almost hear them, the whispers of 1945 saying, We rose when the world had fallen. As night fell over Prague, the city breathed a weary sigh. The streets were quiet, littered with the remnants of battle, burned-out vehicles, shattered glass, and the scent of smoke lingering in every alley. The survivors moved cautiously among the ruins, searching for family, friends, or any sign of normalcy. Despite exhaustion, a profound sense of triumph lingered in the air. Prague had survived. The revolt had tested every limit of courage and endurance, yet the people had prevailed. They had faced one of history's most ruthless armies with little more than determination and improvised weapons. Across the city, makeshift memorials sprang up. Candles flickered in windows, small notes were pinned to doors, and flowers were placed beside stones marking the fallen. The act of remembrance became a ritual even before the war officially ended. The Czech National Council worked tirelessly to restore order. Hospitals operated around the clock, distributing care to the wounded. Streets were cleared, and essential services slowly resumed. Messages of hope were broadcast from radio stations, calling on citizens to rebuild not only buildings, but the spirit of their city. Everywhere, people whispered stories of bravery, of men and women who had faced death with unflinching resolve. Captain František Bartoš, now a symbol of courage, moved through the streets, quietly assisting wherever he could. He visited the families of fallen comrades, offering solace and bearing witness to their sacrifices. His presence reminded the citizens that heroism was not only in battle, but in survival and compassion. Outside the old town hall, survivors gathered to lay wreaths and honor those who had given their lives. Every name etched into the temporary memorial told a story of resistance, determination, and the price of freedom. Even as Soviet soldiers patrolled the city, there was a palpable sense that this victory belonged to Prague itself. The uprising had been a final act of defiance, a testament to human spirit that no empire, no matter how powerful, could extinguish. In the days that followed, journalists from across the globe arrived to document the aftermath. They captured photographs of charred streets, interviewed exhausted fighters, and chronicled the extraordinary courage of civilians. Yet many of these accounts failed to fully convey the intensity of the struggle. The people of Prague understood that the essence of their revolt could not be measured in headlines or photographs. It lived in every street, every building, every memory of those harrowing days. By the end of May, the city was slowly returning to a fragile peace. Essential services stabilized, and children cautiously returned to school. Families began rebuilding homes, clearing debris, and nurturing hope. The scars of battle remained visible, a permanent reminder of what had been endured. But the citizens of Prague had learned a profound lesson, that courage, unity, and an unyielding will could defy even the most formidable oppressors. The revolt, once forgotten, now stood as an enduring symbol of resilience, proving that even in history's darkest hours, humanity can rise. As Prague settled into the uneasy calm after the uprising, the city carried both victory and sorrow. Survivors walked among the ruins, their faces etched with grief for those who had fallen, yet glowing with the quiet pride of having stood against tyranny. The Czech National Council continued its work, organizing food, medical aid, and reconstruction, while documenting the events to preserve the memory of the revolt. Streets once alive with battle cries now echoed with cautious conversations and tentative laughter. In the old town square, citizens gathered to commemorate their dead, lighting candles and leaving simple tributes beside makeshift graves. Stories of bravery circulated, growing with each retelling. Captain František Bartoš became a legend, though he insisted he had only done what anyone would have in his place. Ordinary people, students, tram drivers, housewives, were celebrated alongside him for acts of courage that saved hundreds of lives. Meanwhile, Soviet forces solidified control over the city, providing protection but also asserting authority. Many rebels felt a bittersweet victory. They had freed Prague from the Nazis, yet another power now dictated the city's future. Still, the spirit of resistance endured. Artists, teachers, and writers began recording memories of the uprising, ensuring that its significance would not fade. Songs, poems, and sketches immortalized the courage and sacrifices of the people. International recognition was slow, but eventually historians acknowledged Prague's revolt as a pivotal moment in the closing days of World War II, a testament to civilian courage and unbreakable resolve. Generations later, schoolchildren would learn of the uprising, not just as history, but as a lesson in bravery, unity, and sacrifice. Memorials, museums, and guided tours now preserve the memory of those days. Every year on May 5th, the bells of Prague ring, calling citizens to remember the revolt and honor those who fought. The forgotten revolt, once overshadowed, became a lasting symbol of resilience, showing that even in the final hours of oppression, the human spirit can rise, resist, and prevail. Today, when one walks through Prague's restored streets, the echoes of 1945 linger, a reminder that freedom is never granted, only earned through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve. The city's scars tell a story of pain and endurance, yet also of hope reborn, proving that even the darkest hour can be illuminated by the light of human determination.